Earthlings, and welcome back to my channel where I talk about true crime while I do my makeup. And so without further ado, we're going to get right into this video. In 1979, Glenna Sue Sharp moved from Connecticut to Quincy, California with her and her 5 children in order to get away from her abusive husband. They initially stayed in a trailer home that she rented out from her brother, but over time, the trailer house deemed to be too small for the family of 6. And in the summer of 1980, she found a larger home in the former resort town of Keddie, California. So Keddie, California used to be a bustling town with a railroad that went through it, but after the railroad closed, it started to lose business, and then residents would actually move away. And even though they started to market themselves as a place to go camping or hiking, fun activities, it never really gained back its popularity. Gary Malith, the owner of one of this failed businesses, decided to turn his cabins into long rental units for families of low income. And this is how Sue started to reside in Keddie, California. Although the cabin wasn't 5-star, it provided her and her family a place to stay, and she was appreciative of that. She also liked the fact that it was in a rural, wooded area. Sharp's neighbors reported her as a loner. She didn't really talk to people. She really only had one good friend. Also attended Feather River Community College, where she took business classes, and she strived for really good grades. Law enforcement didn't know her, and she wasn't known, so she really was just to herself, trying to make a better life for her and her family. So the night before the murders, I just want to tell you where everybody was at, so that way you can get a kind of a glimpse. Sue and her youngest 2 kids, Greg and Rick, they were at home. Tina and Sheila, her daughters. So Tina and Sheila, they went out to a neighbor's house. Sheila did stay the night, but Tina came back later on that night. Then her son John and his friend Dana, they were at the house, but then they hitchhiked to a party in Quincy, California, and then they eventually did come home. They were the last people to come home the night before. On Saturday, April 12th of 1981, Sheila spent the night at a neighbor's house, and she was not expected to return home till the next day, like evening, because she was going to attend church with the family. But when she woke up on April 12th, she realized she did not have the clothes she needed to go to church. So because it's a neighbor's house, it was only a couple cabins away, she decided to go home right quick, change, and then attend church. She returned to her family's cabin somewhere between 7:45 and 8 a.m. And when she opened the door, she was welcomed to a disturbing sight. When she opened the door, she discovered her mom, her brother, and her brother's friend dead on the floor. She immediately screamed and turned around to go back to the neighbor's house that she was originally at. And when she got there, she explained what she found, and the neighbors came and they helped her. And I got 2 different reports. So I got the neighbor's dad, and then I got the neighbor's son. So somebody from the neighbors went inside the house, searched to make sure that there was nobody else in there, because Sheila did not search. She just opened the door and ran. So the neighbor wanted to make sure that there was nobody else and to see if anybody else needed help. And this is when he found the 3 little boys in the adjoining room in the back. And so in order to spare them, spare them the sight of what Sheila had to see, they rescued them from the window in their room. Deputy Hank Clement, he was the first to arrive at the scene, and he described blood being everywhere. The direction of the blood indicated that the bodies were moved from their original states and placed where they were discovered in the living room. John was the closest to the door. He was face up. His hands were bloodied and covered and bound together with medical tape, and his throat had been slit. Dana was next to him, and he was on his stomach, so he was face down. His head had a very big gash in it, as if it had been bludgeoned with a blunt object. He was also manually strangled, and he also was bound at the ankle with John. So him and John were bound together at the ankles with an electrical wire. Sue was covered with a blanket, though that did little to hide her gruesome wounds. She was naked from the waist down, and she was on her side. She had been gagged with a bandana and her own underwear that was secured over her mouth with medical tape. She had defensive wounds, so she fought back. She had the imprint of a butt of a .88 pellet gun on the side of her head. Like her son, her throat had also been slit. All victims suffered blunt force trauma to the head with a hammer or by hammers. Each victim suffered stab wounds as well. They found a bent steak knife in the area. They also found a butcher knife and a claw hammer bloodied side by side on a small wooden table near the entrance of the kitchen. So because of the chaos and because how everything was happening, it would actually take investigators hours to realize that there was one person missing. Do you remember? Sheila and Tina both went to the neighbor's house, but Tina came back. So Tina was nowhere to be found. By the time that they realized that she was gone, the FBI was already at the scene. Doug Thomas, the sheriff at the time, and his deputy lieutenant, Don Stay, they could not figure out what the motive could be for this crime. They just had no idea. Like I said earlier, Sue, she was a loner, so there really wasn't much for people to go off of because she didn't necessarily talk to people. The Keddie Cabin murders, they kind of just seemed like a random act of cruelty. The house did not indicate any forced entry. Police did find an unidentified fingerprint on the handrail on the back stairs. They also found that the telephone was off the hook, that the lights were off, and that the drapes were closed. The strangest thing about this case was that the three little boys who were in the back who got rescued, they didn't know, but they were also unaware of the events that were going down. So they didn't even hear or know that people were being slaughtered in the living room or in this entire house while they were actually inside. So there were three boys. There was Rick, Greg, and Justin. So Justin was the neighbor boy. Rick and Greg were Sue's children. The only eyewitness that they had was there was a boyfriend and a girlfriend, a couple who were in a couple cabins down, and they awoken at 1 a.m. to what they described as muffled screams. But because they couldn't indicate where the screams were coming from, they just went back to bed. Rick and Greg claimed that they were asleep when everybody was killed. Their friend Justin wasn't so sure. He started saying that he was having vivid dreams of two men at the front door of the cabin. One of them had a hammer and a knife in their hand. So they started talking to Sue and they were having a conversation. And this is where John and Dana come home from their party. And all of a sudden, a violent outburst just happens and they just start this fight. And he says that he saw Sue get stabbed. During this commotion, Tina went outside of her room to figure out what was going on. And when that happened, one of the men took her and left out the back door. And when he came back, Tina was no longer with him. No one really knows exactly what happened in that specific night, but whatever he did, it rendered her incapable of walking back into the house. Justin was placed under hypnosis, and under his hypnosis, he described the killers. He says that one man was tall with blonde hair and he had a mustache, while the other one was short, dark-haired, and was clean-shaven, and they both wore glasses. So even though this was a great description for the police because they had nothing else at the time, they weren't sure if this was what Justin saw or this is just what Justin got from what was already out in the media. They also found out that he was being asked suggestive questions. There was a lot of potential evidence at the crime scene, but this was pre-DNA days. When everything went down, what people found a little bit suspicious was the fact that Doug Thomas, the sheriff at the time, instead of calling out homicide, because you clearly have 3 dead bodies in a house, they called out organized crime. So that was a little suspicious. Just keep that in mind. Based on the description of Justin, they quickly identified Marty Martin Smart as the prime suspect in these cases. He was a neighbor of Sue. He was a couple cabins down. He was later interviewed. They figured out that he actually took classes with Sue. Also stated that he lost a hammer around the same time of the murders. This was also suspicious because police actually never said in the news that a hammer was involved. So the fact that Martin was already trying to say that a hammer was missing was suspect. His wife, Marilyn, she also found a jacket that she thought was Tina's in the basement of their house, and she actually did turn it into authorities, but there's actually no record of that being cataloged anywhere. So at the time of the murders, he had a house guest named John Bow Bubbied. So it's John Bow Bubbied. I didn't get it right when I recorded it, but I figured out how to say it afterwards. He was known to have connections with organized crime in the area. And it was actually, they found each other, or they became friends not too long before the actual murders. On April 22nd of 1984, a man discovered a human skull in the adjoining Buick County. Near the remains, detectives also found a child's blanket, a blue neon jacket, a pair of jeans with a missing back pocket, and an empty surgical tape dispenser. Buick County Sheriff's Department soon received an anonymous phone call that would eventually lead them to the identity of the remains. It said, "I was wondering if you thought of the murder up in Keddie and Plumas County a couple years ago where the 12-year-old girl was never found." It wasn't until that phone call that they positively identified the remains as Tina Sharp's. Greg Haywood, he was a former Plumas sheriff, and he thought that the reason or the motive for the killing of the family was based on Tina. You leave 3 people in a cabin for their remains to be discovered. I believe there is something about Tina that could not be left to be discovered. There is my strong sense that there was something about Tina that did not allow for her to be left there. That is what he is quoted saying. Sheriff Thomas decides that he wants to resign 3 months into the case, and he took a job at the Sacramento Department of Justice. His handling of the case would be described as disastrous at best and corrupt at the worst. It was said by Sheila that some of the suspects were actually told to leave town. There was a lot of evidence that was overlooked. So the tape of the anonymous caller, well, that tape was left in the evidence sealed, untouched until 13 years later when it was taken over by Greg Haywood and Special Investigator Mike Gamberg. In 2006, Gamberg found a hammer that was believed to be part of the murder weapon in a dried up pond that was once where the Keddie Cabin stood. Also found out that Marilyn Smart, the wife of Martin Smart and the mother of Justin, she left Martin the day that the bodies were discovered. After she left Martin, she actually provided the Plumas County Sheriff's Department with a handwritten letter that was sent to her that was signed by her ex-husband. And it said, "Paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through? Great, what else do you want?" This is something that she gave the Sheriff's Department, but it was not treated as a confession. Marilyn has admitted in a 2008 documentary that she thought her husband Martin and his friend Beau were responsible. Sheriff Thomas will contradict this by stating that Martin had passed his polygraph test, though it was later determined that Martin was actually friends with the sheriff. It was also stated that Martin confessed to his therapist that he killed Sue and Tina. He said, "I killed a mother and her daughter, but I had nothing to do with the boys." The therapist actually did report this to the police, but the police also did nothing about this as well because they stated that this was simply hearsay. Shortly after this, Marty moved to Reno, Nevada, and he basically was never charged or he was never convicted of these crimes. Detectives also interviewed John Bow, who was living with Martin when the events went down, and he was also out with Martin the night that it happened. And he stated that Marilyn was his niece, so Martin's wife was his niece, and that he was also a police officer in Chicago. They later found out that both of these statements were not factual, but again, nothing happened to John at all. He didn't get charged or anything. Since there's very little evidence or very little anything that they can go off in this crime, there are a lot of different theories. Like Greg Haywood's theory about Tina, there is a more widely accepted theory, and that is that Martin, Mary, and Sue are in a love triangle, and it is believed that Sue and Martin were having an affair, and Marilyn was confiding to Sue about her abusive husband, and Sue was actually trying to encourage Marilyn to leave. And Martin did not like this. Martin did not want to leave his wife, and so he enlisted in Beau to get rid of Sue. So this would explain a lot of things. It would explain why Marilyn left Martin the day the bodies were discovered. It would explain why the 3 boys were spared, because Justin was in the room and Justin was his stepson, and he was Marilyn's son. Then it would also explain the handwritten letter that Martin had gave to Marilyn after the murders. Some investigators who picked up the murder in the reinvestigations when it was reopened in 2013, they tied it to a much bigger plot. To Mike Gamberg, it's clear that the Department of Justice and the Thomas Run Sheriff's Department was part of a cover-up. He believes that Martin and Bo were part of a bigger drug smuggling ring. And in this drug smuggling ring, it involved the federal government. It was known that Martin was a drug dealer, while Bo was known to have connections in Chicago with particular interest in drug smuggling. This might also explain why 2 allegedly corrupt organized crime agents were sent out instead of homicide, and this also might explain why the 2 lead suspects were told to leave town and given a slap on the wrist by the sheriff's department. John Bo died in 1988 and Martin Smart died in 2000. Authorities do believe that they were definitely involved in the crime, but they also think that they have help. Mike Gamberg is quoted saying, "I believe that there are individuals that are alive and accessories after the fact." Though Martin Smart and John Bo are both deceased, new DNA evidence has led investigators into the direction of finding suspects who had a hand and who are still alive. That is the end of today's video. Sally, Sue, John, Dana, and Tina did not get the justice that they deserve. Cold cases do get solved every day, so there is still hope. But until then, all we can do is wait. So the video is over now. If you do care, I will be back with my eyelashes, my lipstick, and my hair, and just this is the finished look. If you liked today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I upload twice a week. And until next time, have fun, Earthlings. Peace out.